pretty audacious attack from Israel, although it hasn't claimed responsibility. I think everyone knows that Israel's behind it. On essentially Hezbollah's pager network. Thousands of pages exploded the other day, believed to have been targeting mostly Hezbollah militants and members and higher-ups. Tom, what have you made of this?
No, it was an incredible, audacious move, as you say. I mean, there was the blowing up of the pages as well as the walkie-talkies as well, which, as a combination of both, I think it's more than 40 people have been killed, about 2,500 people injured. And it was an attack that really no one saw coming. I mean, this is as a consequence of the fact that in recent months, Hezbollah have been telling their members, their combatants, their soldiers to stop using mobile phones because they realised that the Israeli intelligence services were on top of them as a consequence of that. But somehow, and people are still trying to put together the pieces as to how these pages ended up in their hands, at what point they were intercepted, at what point they were loaded with these explosives and so on. They've basically pulled off the most remarkable kind of precision attack on terrorists I think we've ever seen. And it's already having all kinds of consequences. I mean, as things might well move on by the time people watch and listen to this, as Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, was giving a televised address today, we're recording on the Thursday, addressing this whole issue and talking about how there are going to be consequences and retaliation and so on. Israel have also begun airstrikes in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah targets as well. All of this does happen in the context of Israel returning the displaced 60,000 people from the north of Israel who've been kind of under fire from Hezbollah since the conflict started. They've made returning those people an actually explicit war aim. So that's also the kind of context in which we're talking about this. So things may well continue to develop and in quite a significant fashion. But it was interesting in the immediate wake of what happened, the kind of speed with which I suppose you could call it the kind of Tears for Hezbollah crowd came out, and we're talking about this explicitly as a war crime, as another example of horrendous Israeli militarism. And it's obviously worth saying that there were some innocents who died as a consequence of this. There's one little girl in particular, and any civilian death in the midst of conflict is horrendous, and no one should be relaxed about that. But at the same time, by any feasible standard of warfare, it doesn't get much more precision targeted than this. And yet what seems to happen is, if there's any kind of crossfire whatsoever, that now seems to be the bar where Israel is concerned. I mean, literally holding to a standard that no one has ever managed to maintain in the midst of war. And so I just think if this is a war crime, if this is something which is reason to show that not just Israeli aggression, but Israel itself is illegitimate, it shows you that they really can do nothing right, really, in the context of not just this conflict, but in general.
And even just the context, the fact that Hezbollah has been attacking Israel since the 7th of October. That is often left out of this discussion. It is only the Israeli retaliations that make the news. In this instance, for good reason, because it was so audacious. I mean, the New York Times has suggested that they didn't even intercept the pages, but they invented a whole network and supply chain of pages to essentially sell to them, via all these shell companies around the world. I mean, it is extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable, and more information is going to be revealed over the coming days. And I think, it's really been fascinating for a lot of people because it is, a new development that we may never have seen, in the past at all. But I think, at least for me, the key point is, what Tom said about the fact that it does feel like, damned if you do, damned if you don't. One of the biggest criticisms of Israel in how it's conducted this war, the arguments which are, compelling to some extent in the sense that, it's a very densely populated area, Palestine, a very young population, all of these types of things. And obviously Israel has come back and said that Hamas is very much embedded in their tunnel network, and they use people as human shields. We're all familiar with some of those arguments that are made. Whereas, in this context, in a different example where it is extremely precise, perhaps one of the most precise examples of, an attack. As you mentioned, there has been innocents killed, but it's still, relatively speaking, very, very precise. You've had all these people coming out and, condemning Israel once again. So it really does just make you think that it isn't really about, completely how Israel's conducting this war. It's that Israel has no right to take any measures to defend itself.
Or even to exist in some people's minds, of course.
No, and it's one of those things where all you do is have to think back to the way in which when the Western powers were going after ISIS. You know, for instance, when al-Baghdadi was killed, I'm almost certainly took a fair few innocents with him, unfortunately, in that particular operation. But it would be bizarre for everyone at that particular moment to make that the focus, you know, when the leader of this genocidal terror group had finally been caught up with. And yet the double standard is always there. Maybe that's less surprising from people like Jeremy Corbyn, who have been pretty friendly with Hezbollah for a very long time. But the fact that the kind of mainstreaming of that profound, really sympathy for these terrorist groups amongst the great and good more generally, the reflexive suspicion for anything that Israel does, even as it's fighting what is fundamentally a defensive war on various different fronts now. I mean, we talk a lot about Gaza, obviously, but the Hezbollah piece of the question, the Houthis piece of the question, the Iran front, I mean, all of these things are sometimes skated over. That's one of the things that's been striking post-October the 7th. There's always been that section of the supposedly kind of anti-imperialist, anti-Israel left who have a tendency to lionize the Islamists and demonize the Israelis. But the way in which that's just become, I don't want to say mainstream, but certainly more widespread than it was previously is something that's really quite striking in the midst of all this.